This meeting is being recorded.
Can you see and hear?
Yes, but it's a reduced size.
Okay. Let me see if I can change the... How about now?
Yep, much better. That works.
Okay. If I was to tell you that the burger you ate last week or the milk you had of your cereal this morning was climate neutral, I think that would be quite an eye-catching claim that I just made. And if you're a consumer, you might think that's great news because you've probably heard in the news the last few years that there's a big environmental impact of meat and dairy food. But because we're methane researchers here today, methane researchers, you'd hear that claim and you'd probably want to find out more about it. You'd probably know that methane is responsible for about 0.5 degrees Celsius of global warming today, and about 1/3 of that comes from the livestock sectors. And so what I'm going to do today is precisely that. Look into this claim and explore the story behind it. And this talk, I will be discussing the measuring aspects that are part of this story, how we measure short-lived and long-lived climate pollutants. I'll be discussing also the role of language in this story, language interpretation of the Paris Agreement, and also language of how we present the warming impact of methane. And also the responsibilities that are associated with the emissions of methane and its mitigation. And at the heart of this story about climate neutral claims is the greenhouse gas methane, which makes today a very exciting time for me to present this to this group. And to put up front some of the conclusions that I'll be reaching, on the measurement side, I'll be arguing that GWP star, which is a method of counting for methane that I'll come onto later, is not a global warming metric and should not be used at the sub-global level. On the language aspect of the story, I'll be arguing that ambiguity in the Paris Agreement text has led to some of this debate, and it has been a particular interpretation which has introduced inconsistencies in the Paris Agreement itself, which has led to some of these controversies over climate neutral claims. And on the responsibilities, I will be arguing that GWP star, combined with this distorted interpretation of the Paris Agreement, is what has resulted in misleading climate neutral claims that are not aligned with the responsibilities of the Paris Agreement, and particularly those around burden sharing and fair mitigation. The story for me begins when I joined UC Davis. I arrived partway through my PhD. I'm sure everyone can tell from the accent that I was not born in the US. I grew up in the UK and came partway through my PhD to UC Davis. And UC Davis has a large animal science department, a lot of research into agriculture and also the environmental impact of agriculture. And it was there that I first heard these claims made that livestock sectors are or could readily become climate neutral. And that was defined as no longer contributing to global warming. And these claims, I first heard them in 2021, and then it was in 2022 that a paper was published by some of the scientists at UC Davis, which were making these claims now in peer-reviewed literature. And those claims were made in other papers in the US, Australia, Europe. Developed nation livestock sectors were the focus of these peer-reviewed papers on how livestock could readily become climate neutral and they were using a new measurement tool, GWP star. To go into a little bit of the detail of some of these claims, this is a couple of quotes from some of these papers, and the table on the right appears in the paper that I published with my co-author, Donald Murphy-Bocken, last year. And you can see some of these claims are made on the left-hand side about dairy sectors, meat sectors, and they are telling us that these sectors are or could readily become climate neutral, again, defined as no longer contributing to global warming. Now, in the case of the third bullet point there, this is from Place et al., arguing that US dairy could be climate neutral with a reduction of farm level emissions by 23%. How can a livestock sector be climate neutral with such modest mitigation of methane? And that is what I'm going to explore. This is an example. This is that paper, the Place et al. Paper. This here is a paper from an Australian researcher arguing about the Australian sector. And you can see there in the figure, the sheep meat has, according to GWP star, a negative climate impact in that case, which they call equivalent to CO2 removal. We're all familiar with the abundant research on the environmental impact of different food products. And this is particularly why these claims are so interesting, because we know that the meat and dairy sectors have a particular challenge around their greenhouse gas emissions. If we're though to take a step back and explore what's going on here, so we know that livestock sectors are major contributors of methane emissions, but we'll also be very familiar here that methane and CO2 are very different greenhouse gases. And a gas like carbon dioxide is a long-lived climate pollutant, has a very long residency in the atmosphere, and often where we've referred to it as a stock greenhouse gas, where warming is generated by these cumulative emissions of the gas. And that's fundamentally different to methane, a short-lived climate pollutant, where the residency in the atmosphere is much shorter, about 12 years for methane. And therefore, the warming today is largely determined by the recent emissions. And this has presented a challenge for the traditional global warming potential metric, which imperfectly equates emissions of a short-lived climate pollutant into an equivalent of a long-lived climate pollutant, CO2. And so that has challenges because it results in GWP 100 effectively underestimating the warming impact of rising methane and overestimating the warming impact of declining methane, which has important implications when we're looking at global policy on climate and emissions. And the figure there below just represents how these gases are fundamentally different. The flow impact of methane versus the stock of a long-lived climate pollutant like CO2. To address this, there have been various attempts over the years, not just the GWP star, but this figure just shows what I just said effectively, increasing emissions, constant and decreasing, and how methane and CO2 react differently. And it's particularly relevant, say, a constant emission of methane will lead to a sustained constant level of warming, whereas constant emissions of CO2 will cumulatively increase that warming. And to address this, a new calculation was presented by Miles Allen and his group at the University of Oxford in 2018, GWP star. And this approach is different to GWP 100 in that it looks at the rate of change over time of these gases, and it effectively equates a change in the emissions of methane over time into a one-off pulse of CO2. And this new metric is somewhat different to calculate the warming impact of gases, whereas if GWP 100 or GWP 20, for example, you are multiplying the emissions of methane by this factor to get the common currency of CO2. With GWP star, you're looking at a rate of change over time. The LLNL group look at a change over 20 years, and you're looking at how the methane gas has changed in that 20-year period, and that change is what then drives the result of the metric. And the advantage of this is that it better models how changes in methane affect global temperature. And as Alan et al. In that paper pointed out, that becomes important when we're looking at approaching temperature limits, trying to understand how we achieve the Paris Agreement temperature goal. And it can very helpfully for policy show us this emergency handbrake that you can get from methane mitigation, which can reduce warming in a way that mitigation of CO2 will not. However, it's not a global warming metric because it's interested in this change of emissions over time. It's looking at the change of warming and not the absolute level of warming. And in our communications, my co-author and I have used the analogy of a car driving on a road. GWP 100 is interested in the absolute speed that vehicle is traveling at. And perhaps if it's traveling above a certain speed limit, we can think of that as emissions being beyond a compatible scenario for delivering a warming target. GWP star is interested in the rate of change, whether that car has sped up or decreased its speed. And that makes them fundamentally very different approaches to looking at greenhouse gases. And this is why you could have a scenario where two cars are given the same result from GWP star, but could actually be traveling at very different speeds because it's interested in how the change, the rate of recent change in their speed affects the warming. And I'll go on to argue why that makes this a very challenging and unsuitable tool for looking at the warming impact of sectors and countries subglobally, because effectively two emitters could be considered to be having the same impact on climate change, but sustaining very different levels of warming. And one thing that I'll also argue is that this name, GWP star, is somewhat misleading because it implies an improved version of the traditional global warming potentials. To look at how this metric was used in the papers I mentioned earlier on to generate these claims of climate neutral food products, we need to next look at the Paris Agreement and look at the text involved in that agreement. The articles that I'm going to discuss today are Articles 2 and 4, and Article 2 concerns the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, and Article 4 is about the emissions associated with achieving that goal. So Article 2, the key text here is that the Paris Agreement will result in this increase in global average temperatures being limited to below 2 degrees, and with this effort to achieve a 1.5 degree limit. That's the temperature goal. Article 4, which is read alongside Article 2, talks about achieving a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases. And these are the two key planks of the Paris Agreement and the two that are relevant to this discussion. Now, this Article 4 has widely been interpreted as climate neutral in policy communications. For example, the European Union's climate change goal refers to climate neutral as this balance between emissions and sinks. And this is what makes this discussion of climate neutral when it relates to the claims I talk about today somewhat confusing, because that is a different interpretation, which I'll come on to. The Place et al. Paper, which I mentioned earlier on with one of these claims, argues that this temperature goal of the Paris Agreement makes this agreement different from the emission goals of historical agreements. And this is really where there's a differing in interpretation of the Paris Agreement, which ultimately leads to a trading off between Articles 2 and 4, putting the two articles into conflict. Because it is suggested here that you might be able to achieve one goal and actually not achieve the other. And that would be meeting the Paris Agreement. The Place et al. Paper, they noted that this climate neutral claim of theirs, it doesn't rest on a formal definition from the IPCC, but they put forward that it could be interpreted as no additional climate impact. That would be something that is climate neutral. When I started looking at these claims, I followed the reference they gave for that definition, and it led to a industry discussion paper which actually defined climate neutral somewhat differently, a state in which human activities result in no net effect on the climate system. And so it's somewhat confusing that their citation for their definition of climate neutral actually has a different definition itself. And this will I'll come back to this later, in the challenges of communicating climate goals and some of these terms that get used inconsistently. So it's not placed on a definition that is consistent with what they're trying to do. But nonetheless, let's look at this claim. And the figure I showed earlier on showed this fundamental difference between emissions of methane and CO2. And if you'll just look at the left-hand side, you can see here that constant emissions of the two gases lead to a quite different impact on warming. And the combined impact in warming is an increase in warming. If you have CO2 and methane emissions coming from an agricultural sector, and they're both constant, you'll have increase in warming over time because of the impact of the long-lived climate pollutant influencing that. If your agricultural sector, for example, Californian dairy, manages to reduce its methane emissions, then that will lead to an impact of less warming. It'll reduce the warming impact. However, the claims that we saw were that the methane would be reduced while you still had ongoing CO2 emissions. And the bottom right-hand pane here shows that that actually is going to give you this temporary net result of warming being held constant when the short-term impact of the methane mitigation effectively offsets the warming of the ongoing CO2. But that effect is temporary because the atmospheric residency of methane is temporary itself. And what would then happen is that after that, warming would continue to go up because of the driver of the long-lived climate pollutant of CO2. So this was the first error that we found in this thinking, that if you wanted to stop any further warming from a sector by effectively using methane mitigation to offset further warming from CO2, you would actually have to continually cut the methane. You couldn't just have this cut in methane and then this state of climate neutrality, again, defined as no further global warming. So you can see that they may have achieved that no further warming there. They're holding their warming impact constant, but then after that mitigation impact has been felt, the warming then is continuing because of these further emissions from the CO2. This here is a figure from the Place et al. Paper, and it shows this model that they'd built where there's cumulative emissions and cumulative warming impact. This is using GW star in practice, and they've converted this into CO2 warming equivalent emissions, which is the way that GW star is measured. And they're implementing these reductions in methane, and those reductions in methane are temporarily offsetting warming from ongoing CO2 and temporarily leading to this state where that sector is not contributing further warming. It's still sustaining its historical level of warming, but it's not contributing further. But that effect itself is temporary unless you were to continually cut the methane, which was not noted in this or the other studies. There were several other issues as well as this temporary neutrality. There was also an issue with incomplete life cycle emissions, and some of these studies that we scrutinized in our paper only looked at the methane emissions. So the temporary problem I just noted there from the Place et al. Paper, this at least was including the CO2 emissions associated with the livestock sector production there. And of course, you'll also have nitrous oxide emissions as well, which also has a longer residency than methane. But there was also some studies that just looked at the methane emissions. Well, that's a lot easier to claim that you've got a state of no further warming if you're just looking at the methane emissions. So there were some papers that had incomplete life cycle emissions. Even for the Place et al. Study that considered the long-lived pollutants from CO2 and nitrous oxide, they were only looking at the farm gate emissions and didn't consider the wider sector, but their claims of climate neutrality were for the industry as a whole. So we had these flawed methodologies which didn't account for the full emissions and were not considering the temporary aspect of this climate neutral state, this state of no further warming, sustaining the level of warming that you historically caused. But thinking back to the Paris Agreement, there were some further complications or misleading aspects of these claims. The term climate neutral, I said earlier on, was first used to refer to this balance between emissions and sinks, and is interpreted by a number of governments, and I mentioned the EU, whose climate neutral target is about net zero greenhouse gases. It was adapted by these papers that were using GW star based on this distorted interpretation of the Paris Agreement that you could perhaps meet Article 2 by achieving no further warming, but still have all these ongoing emissions that would effectively be in conflict with Article 4. And this really is why we argue that Articles 2 and 4 were traded off against each other by these claims, because they were arguing that you could have continued emissions of greenhouse gases, but somehow still meet the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. And there's been some academic debate about the interpretation of the Paris Agreement and some disagreement over exactly how it should be interpreted. But we felt quite clearly in our work that this is a distorted interpretation and is a real threat to global climate policy. Another problem with these papers and this use of GW star to claim climate neutrality is that it grandfathers the emissions of these large existing emitters. And I mentioned earlier on that this use of GW star is looking at the changes in emissions and not the absolute levels. And I mentioned earlier on that there's a challenge here that two emitters, two cars traveling on the road, could be going at very different speeds, but they could be treated equally by GW star because of this rate of change interest. And this has particular implications for the livestock sectors of developing countries. So developed nation livestock sectors have seen some modest methane mitigation, and that is why you can use GW star to argue that they're not causing further warming. But livestock sectors in developing nations, though much smaller and associated with much fewer methane emissions per capita for those countries, those sectors are growing. And because GW star is interested in the rate of change, that increase in emissions over time in those developing sectors is going to be counted as a significant increase on warming. So you can have these perverse impacts where a developing nation livestock sector is seen by GW star as contributing much more to warming than a developed nation sector with steady or gently declining emissions. And that's why this paper by Rugel and Schleusner argues that there's this grandfathering bias to GW star that can really work against the principles of burden sharing and fair responsibilities in the Paris Agreement. The final issue related to the Paris Agreement is that, just quite simply, these claims, they result from methane mitigation, which is significantly short of what we know we need to do to achieve the temperature goal. And we need to reduce methane emissions by around half between 2020 and 2050 to achieve that goal. We don't have to go to zero, and that relates to these different residency periods of methane and CO2. We need net zero CO2 to stop warming. We don't need net zero methane to stop warming, but we do need aggressive and deep cuts. And the fall of around half that we need is far greater than the modest reductions that were claimed in these papers we looked at. The Place et al. Paper suggesting a 23% mitigation across that time period. And that was actually one of the more ambitious reductions. Some of the other sectors in other papers were suggesting even less mitigation. So it's unaligned to the pace, the global pace, let alone what you might expect from a developed nation's livestock sector, a developed nation that would be considered to be showing a leadership role in emission reduction. And that's why this shortfall of the global pace is also having these issues around fair burden sharing that comes out from this grandfathering bias of these emissions. So our paper was published in December 2023, and we, in that paper, brought forward these arguments I've just noted. We scrutinized 6 papers that were applying GW star to livestock sectors that were all making these claims about climate neutrality. And we pointed out these methodological flaws and also these concerning implications for the Paris Agreement if these claims were to be accepted. The paper came out about the same time as the last COP gathering, where there was actually, for the first time, a day dedicated to discussing the food sector and climate implications there. So it's a very active discussion, an area of debate, and we coincided with that to try and get this piece into the conversation. The goal was to nip this misleading narrative in the bud, this narrative that we can have climate neutral livestock from modest mitigation of methane, and that we therefore don't have to be considering the deep and aggressive methane mitigation that has been suggested elsewhere. And following our paper, there was interest from a number of media sectors. There was a piece written by Smog. There was also something written by The Guardian, and they asked for comments from the original creators of the GW star metric, who agreed that our paper showed this metric was being misused. And that's great, although I still think that there's a responsibility on the creators of this metric to have communicated it in a way that was not allowing it to be misused in this way. I do think that the metric was poorly communicated, and also introduced without the guardrails for its use. So there was no discussion of its use sub-globally in those original papers from the makers of GW star, but that's how it was used by the papers we looked at. And without guardrails for its use, there was this opportunity to use it in this way. And there has been a commentary from some of the makers of GW star that the tool itself does not imply that a sector should aim to be climate neutral. It doesn't imply that every country should have a climate neutral goal, and that actually to fairly meet your responsibilities, you may have to go further than that. It's welcome to read that, but without the guardrails around the use of this tool sub-globally, that's how it was used. And I've seen no published attempt to fairly use this tool sub-globally, which would effectively require countries to have very different goals of what their warming reduction would need to be. So if every country, it's not fair to say that they should achieve no further warming from their methane emitting sectors, then you'd have some complicated situation where some would have to go far below this and some would be allowed to go above. There's been no attempt to work out what the fair distribution of that would be. And I don't think the tool itself is set up in a way that allows it to be easily done. So there's no clear path to using GW star subglobally without there being these problems of its misuse and these fairness implications coming up. We didn't see any comments on the scientific argument we put forward from the authors of the studies we scrutinized, from these people that were making these claims. No one really directly engaged with our arguments. And so I'm still unsure what exactly their attitudes are and what their next steps are. However, there has now been a discussion of the dual reporting of different greenhouse gases. There's something, for example, that Miles Allen, the original creator of GW Star, has been advocating for more recently. And there's been some consensus that because of the challenges inherent to these different greenhouse gases and trying to evaluate them together, that perhaps we do actually need to report them both separately and think about mitigation goals that are separate for them. It's not quite the end of the story, and this is a very active area of discussion in policy circles, in industry circles. Whilst we wanted to nip this narrative in the bud, there's been a real runaway of some of these misleading interpretations in the agricultural policy circles, in farming circles. This narrative that GW 100 gives the wrong answer has even found its way onto a viral TikTok video that's been seen a shockingly large number of times for such a wonky bit of climate science. And there's been this use of interchangeable use of warming and further warming, when our research shows that these are two quite different things. So there's a real challenge out there with trying to get the communication across. And that's evident now in some quite active policy discussions and industry goals that could well be moving towards GW star. For example, in the US, the National Cattlemen and Beef Association, they have adopted a climate neutral goal for 2040. They're sticking to that target. Right now in New Zealand and Australia, there are very active discussions of these goals also being adopted. The Meat and Livestock Australia Association, they previously had a carbon neutral target for 2030, but it's been reported recently, and as recently as several weeks ago, that they're looking now to drop that and to adopt a climate neutral target. New Zealand, I've been told, is also imminently going to adopt a climate neutral target. And these two countries are ones that would benefit significantly because they have such large methane emissions from very mature and established livestock sectors, and they have the potential to achieve some modest mitigation. There's even been the application of GW star to a whole country, and there was an opinion piece written suggesting that if New Zealand were to adopt GW star, then they could effectively achieve climate neutrality very easily, despite these ongoing CO2 emissions, because their methane emissions are so large. And also, there's now a discussion of using GW star alongside GW 100, and that's, for example, in the UK. My co-author Donal and I submitted evidence to the parliamentary inquiry that's taking place right now, looking at the roles of these two approaches to measuring greenhouse gases. So this debate is ongoing. Our paper is now part of the debate, but there's a lot of, I think, distorted understanding of the warming impact of methane and on what the mitigation responsibility should be. And it feels somewhat like the toothpaste is out the tube, and there's a lot of challenges in trying to get the correct science communicated in this quite challenging and at times messy and confusing debate. One final thing I want to discuss before finishing this is a recent paper that was published that made reference to our work, but looked more broadly at the challenges of communicating climate policy and the challenges of looking at the Paris Agreement's implications at the subglobal level. And this opinion piece really noted the challenges of scientists addressing the use of terms like climate neutral for sectors and nations, and particularly their use presented as if they are self-evident and scientific. And this relates to net zero implications as well. How we interpret the Paris goals to fair burdens nationally and sectorally is a great challenge. And it's not just exclusive to this debate about methane in livestock and the role of Jubilee Star. And it's going to become more challenging as we really try and ramp up our mitigation of greenhouse gases and try to meet these climate goals. It's a really challenging space for good climate science to be cutting through and to communicating the use of these terms. And there's a real concern for greenwashing. What we found was greenwashing using this misleading climate neutral term, and there's examples of greenwashing elsewhere. One concern we even had in our paper was, could an oil and gas company that's extracting these fossil fuels from the ground, could they even fix some of the leaky pipes that they have there, show that that's reduced the methane emissions from their operations, and then try and use that to offset some of the emissions from their other aspects of their activities and production? And could they claim that that's climate neutral? We've not seen that happen, but that would be one other example of how this debate could result in greenwashing elsewhere. I've also seen it discussed in the aviation sector, where the warming impact of a plane is only roughly half from the CO2 impact, and there's these other non-CO2 warming impacts, particularly from the contrails. Now, those are also having a very short residency in the atmosphere, a very short and aggressive impact on warming. Could there even be the implications of this science there, where again, maybe the interpretation could be that they don't actually have to reduce their emissions to net zero? So there's some wider implications of the use of these tools, and there's wider implications of how we communicate good climate science and address greenwashing. And with that, I will finish and be very interested to hear any comments or where the discussion goes. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Caspar. Quite a bit of food for thought.